The town of Crestview was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. It wasn't a town where things happened. People lived quiet lives, raised families, and kept to themselves. So when the Crestview Medical Center posted a job opening for a night shift security guard, it didn't take long for Daniel Mercer to apply. Daniel had been out of work for a while. He'd lost his previous job at a factory after an unfortunate accident left him with a limp. He needed something that wouldn't be too physically demanding, something where he could just keep an eye on things and make sure nothing went wrong. The night shift at a hospital seemed like the perfect fit. Crestview Medical Center wasn't a large hospital. It had a few wings, an emergency room, a maternity ward, some general care units, and an old, barely used wing that had been shut down years ago. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough, and Daniel was grateful for the opportunity. Plus, the quiet, uneventful nights were exactly what he needed. His first shift started on a Monday. The sun had just set as Daniel walked into the hospital, his footsteps echoing in the nearly empty lobby. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman named Karen, gave him a brief nod and pointed him toward the security office. "Welcome to the night shift," she said, her voice heavy with fatigue. "It's usually pretty quiet around here. Just make your rounds, check the cameras, and you'll be fine." Daniel smiled and nodded, feeling a little more at ease. He had done security work before, and this seemed like it would be an easy gig. The security office was small, tucked away in a corner near the emergency room. Inside, a bank of monitors displayed feeds from various cameras around the hospital, mostly empty hallways and dimly lit rooms. There was a desk with a radio, a logbook, and a set of keys. Daniel sat down, taking in his new surroundings. The hospital was quiet, with only the occasional sound of footsteps or the distant murmur of voices breaking the silence. It was almost too quiet, he thought, but he reminded himself that this was a good thing. The quieter the night, the easier the job. As the hours passed, Daniel made his rounds, walking through the empty halls, checking the locked doors, and peering into darkened rooms. The hospital felt deserted, almost eerie, but Daniel brushed off the unease that crept over him. It was just his imagination, he told himself. Hospitals were always a little creepy at night. Around midnight, Daniel returned to the security office and sat down to watch the monitors. He was about to settle in for a long, uneventful night when something caught his eye on one of the screens. The camera feed from the old, unused wing of the hospital flickered, showing a brief, shadowy movement. Daniel leaned in closer, squinting at the monitor. The image was grainy and distorted, but he could have sworn he saw someone moving in the hallway. Daniel frowned. That wing was supposed to be locked up, shut down years ago after a new wing was built to replace it. No one was supposed to be in there. Curious, and with a growing sense of unease, Daniel decided to investigate. He grabbed his flashlight and the set of keys from the desk before heading down the hall. As he approached the entrance to the old wing, he noticed the air felt colder, and the usual sterile scent of the hospital was replaced with a faint, musty odor, like old dust and decay. The door to the old wing was indeed locked, but as Daniel slid the key into the lock and turned it, he felt a strange resistance, as if the door itself was reluctant to open. With a creak that echoed down the empty hallway, the door finally gave way, revealing the dark corridor beyond. Daniel hesitated for a moment, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with old, unused hospital rooms. The walls were peeling, the tiles cracked, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and shift. As he stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind him, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Daniel walked slowly down the hallway, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He kept his flashlight moving, sweeping it across the walls and floor, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just empty rooms, long-abandoned medical equipment, and the occasional rat scurrying away from the light. But the further he went, the stronger the feeling that he wasn't alone became. There was something wrong with this place, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He felt a presence, like eyes watching him from the shadows. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Daniel cursed under his breath, tapping the flashlight in a futile attempt to get it working again. As he fumbled in the dark, he heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper, just on the edge of hearing. His heart pounded in his chest. He stood still, straining to listen. The whisper came again, a sibilant, eerie sound that sent chills down his spine. It seemed to be coming from one of the rooms up ahead. With a sense of dread settling in his stomach, Daniel cautiously moved forward. The whispering grew louder as he approached the room, until it was almost like a low, hissing chant. He reached the doorway, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. The room was empty, as far as he could see. It was small, with a single, broken bed and a rusted metal chair in the corner. But there was something else, a presence, a feeling of intense malevolence that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he noticed something on the wall. In the dim light filtering in from the hallway, he could make out faint, almost indistinguishable words scrawled across the peeling wallpaper. He moved closer, squinting to read the writing. "Get out." The words were scratched into the wall, as if by someone's fingernails. The writing was frantic, desperate, and there was something about it that sent a jolt of fear through Daniel. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on him from all sides. The air grew colder, and Daniel could see his breath misting in the air. He felt a presence behind him, something standing just out of sight, watching him. Daniel whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. But he knew, without a doubt, that he was not alone. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl that sent pure terror coursing through Daniel's veins. It came from somewhere deep in the hospital, echoing through the empty halls like the growl of a feral animal. Panic surged through him. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the dark as he fled the old wing. He didn't stop until he was back in the brightly lit main corridor of the hospital, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Daniel leaned against the wall, his heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he imagined it? Was it some kind of prank? But the fear that had gripped him was real, as was the writing on the wall. He knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going back into that old wing. The next night, Daniel arrived at the hospital more on edge than ever. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder more than usual. The old wing loomed large in his thoughts, but he had no intention of going back there. Karen, the receptionist, greeted him with her usual tired smile. "How was your first night?" she asked. Daniel forced a smile. "Quiet," he lied. "Just getting used to the place." "Good," Karen replied, though she gave him a curious look, as if she could sense something was off. "You'll get the hang of it soon enough. Just remember to stay away from the old wing. That place gives everyone the creeps." Daniel nodded, but said nothing. He made his way to the security office, where he settled in for another long night. He hoped it would be uneventful, but a part of him knew that whatever was lurking in the old wing wasn't done with him yet. Hours passed, and the hospital was as quiet as ever. Daniel made his rounds, avoiding the old wing, but the unease never left him. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister, and every creak of the floorboards set his nerves on edge. Around midnight, as Daniel was checking the security monitors. The camera feed from the old wing flickered again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was moving in the darkness. A figure appeared on the screen, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was a shadowy silhouette, indistinct and featureless, but unmistakably human. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he watched the figure slowly turn its head, as if looking directly at the camera. For a moment, their eyes seemed to meet through the screen, and Daniel felt a cold dread wash over him. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Daniel's hands shook as he switched off the monitor. He couldn't explain what he had just seen, but he knew he wasn't imagining it. Something was in that old wing, something that didn't belong there. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence. Daniel avoided the old wing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure, its gaze boring into him. When his shift finally ended, Daniel left the hospital as quickly as he could, the early morning light doing little to calm his nerves. He knew he couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep coming back to this place. But he needed the job, and quitting wasn't an option. Not yet. As he walked to his car, he noticed someone standing by the entrance, watching him. It was an old man, hunched over with age, his face lined with wrinkles. He wore a long coat, and his eyes were dark and piercing. "You're the new night guard, aren't you?" the old man said, his voice raspy. Daniel stopped, surprised. "Yeah, I am. Can I help you?" The old man shook his head slowly. "No, but I can help you. You need to leave this place, son. It's not safe." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "I worked here once," the old man continued, his voice low. "Long time ago. That old wing. It's cursed. Something happened there, something terrible. They tried to cover it up, but the evil remains. It's been growing, feeding off the fear. You need to get out before it's too late." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "What happened?" The old man looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "There was an experiment, something the doctors were doing in secret. It went wrong, horribly wrong. People died, but they didn't stay dead. The things they unleashed, they're still there, waiting." Daniel swallowed hard. Why hasn't anyone done anything about it? Why hasn't anyone done anything about it? The old man laughed bitterly. "They tried. The hospital board closed the wing, sealed it off. But the evil inside can't be contained. It's been waiting for someone to let it out, someone to feed it. And now it's found you." The old man's words filled Daniel with a deep, primal fear. He wanted to dismiss them as the ramblings of a crazy old man, but after what he had seen, he couldn't. "I can't just leave," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "I need this job. Better to be alive and broke than rich and dead," the old man said, his eyes burning with intensity. "Get out while you still can, before it takes you." With that, the old man turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, his mind reeling. He didn't know what to make of the old man's warning. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but another part of him, the part that had seen the shadowy figure on the monitor, couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to it. Daniel got into his car and drove home, but the unease followed him, lingering in the back of his mind like a shadow. By the time he got home, he was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He collapsed onto his bed, hoping sleep would come quickly and bring some relief. But sleep was elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the old wing, the dark corridor, the shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway. The old man's words echoed in his mind. "Get out while you still can." When he finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were plagued with nightmares. He was back in the hospital, wandering the dark halls, the walls closing in on him. The whispering started again, growing louder, more insistent. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move, as if he were wading through thick mud. The shadowy figure appeared in front of him, its face still indistinct, but now it was closer, almost within reach. It stretched out a hand, fingers elongated and skeletal, reaching for him. Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's hand touched his chest, and an icy cold spread through him, freezing him in place. Daniel woke with a start, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. His room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of his alarm clock. It was just a dream, he told himself, just a nightmare, but the fear that gripped him was real, and it refused to let go. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Daniel tried to distract himself, tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, but the unease never left him. As the evening approached, the thought of returning to the hospital filled him with dread, but he had no choice. He needed the job, so despite the growing sense of fear gnawing at him, Daniel got dressed and headed back to Crestview Medical Center for his next shift. When Daniel arrived at the hospital, the familiar sense of foreboding washed over him. The night was darker than usual, the air heavy with humidity. He glanced up at the building, its windows darkened like lifeless eyes staring down at him. The sense of being watched returned, and he had to force himself to take the steps leading to the entrance. Inside, the hospital was quiet, as it always was at night. The fluorescent lights cast a sterile, almost sickly glow on the walls. Daniel checked in with Karen, who gave him a sympathetic smile, as if she could sense his unease. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, half joking. Daniel forced a chuckle. "Just didn't get much sleep," he replied. "Nightmares?" she asked, her tone more serious now. "Something like that," Daniel admitted. Karen's expression softened. "This place can do that to you. The night shift messes with your head. Just try to take it easy." Daniel nodded, appreciating her concern, but he knew that the source of his anxiety went beyond just sleep deprivation. He wasn't dealing with an ordinary job or the usual pressures of life. Something was wrong in this hospital, something that defied logic and reason. As Daniel walked toward the security office, he noticed something odd. A cold draft, stronger than usual, seemed to be coming from the direction of the old wing. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him, but didn't alter his course. He had no intention of going near that place again. The night started quietly enough. Daniel settled into his routine, making his rounds, checking the cameras. He avoided the old wing, but as the hours dragged on, his curiosity gnawed at him. The old man's warning, the strange events of the previous night, all weighed heavily on his mind. Just after midnight, as Daniel was reviewing the security logs, the radio on his desk crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a voice came through, faint and distorted. "Help, please, can't get out." Daniel froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was weak, full of panic, but it was unmistakable. Someone was calling for help. He grabbed the radio, pressing the button to respond. "This is security. Who is this? Where are you?" There was no immediate response, just more static. Then the voice came again, clearer this time, though still filled with fear. I'm trapped. Can't see. Where are you?" Daniel repeated, his voice rising with urgency. The radio crackled, and the voice came through once more. But this time, it was different, hoarse, almost inhuman. "Come, to the old wing." Daniel's blood ran cold. The voice was no longer that of a scared person calling for help. It was something else, something that made his skin crawl. For a moment, Daniel considered ignoring the call. It was probably just another trick, another attempt to lure him back to the old wing. But then he thought about what would happen if he didn't investigate. If there really was someone in danger, he couldn't just sit here and do nothing. Against his better judgment, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and started toward the old wing. The hallway seemed longer than before, the shadows deeper, darker. Every step he took felt like it was pulling him closer to something terrible, something he couldn't escape. The door to the old wing was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness beyond it. Daniel pushed it open with a trembling hand, the creak of the hinges sounding like a scream in the silence. The air inside was thick and stale, the musty smell stronger than before. He stepped into the corridor, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The walls seemed to close in around him, the temperature dropping the further he went. His breath fogged in the cold air, and he could feel the oppressive weight of the place bearing down on him. The corridor stretched ahead, the whispering starting again, low and insistent, just on the edge of hearing. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he moved deeper into the old wing, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to run. But he couldn't, not yet. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping, intertwining, forming a chorus of terror. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was clear. It was a warning, a plea, a command to leave this place before it was too late. Daniel rounded a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. At the end of the hallway stood the figure he had seen on the monitor. It was no longer a shadowy silhouette, but a tall, gaunt figure, its face shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at Daniel. The whispering grew louder, more frenzied, as if the very walls were screaming at him to run. But Daniel couldn't move, his body frozen in place by a fear so intense it was paralyzing. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Daniel's flashlight flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. The air grew colder still, and Daniel felt a crushing pressure in his chest, as if the very atmosphere was trying to suffocate him. Finally, the paralysis broke, and Daniel turned and ran. He sprinted down the hallway, the sound of his own footsteps echoing in his ears. The whispering followed him, growing louder, more frantic, as if the walls themselves were alive, urging him to flee. He reached the door to the old wing, practically slamming into it as he burst through. The door swung shut behind him with a loud bang, cutting off the whispering abruptly. Daniel didn't stop running until he was back in the security office, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He collapsed into the chair, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The radio was silent now, no more voices, no more calls for help. The only sound was the pounding of his heart and the ragged sound of his breathing. Daniel sat there for a long time, trying to calm himself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. The old wing was haunted, cursed. There was no other explanation. And whatever was in there, whatever had been unleashed, it was coming for him. He knew he couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep coming back to this place, knowing what was waiting for him in the darkness. The old man had been right. He needed to get out, to leave before it was too late. But as he sat there, trying to summon the courage to walk away, a deep, unsettling realization crept over him. It was already too late. The days blurred into nights, and the nights into an endless parade of terror. Daniel continued to work the night shift, though each shift brought with it a new level of dread. The old wing haunted him, even when he was far from it. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, whispering voices followed him, and the figure he had seen continued to appear on the monitors, always watching, always waiting. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself that it was all in his head. But the signs of something more sinister were impossible to deny. Equipment malfunctioned in strange ways, lights flickered inexplicably, and doors that were supposed to be locked would be found open. Leading into the old wing, Daniel's sleep became a series of nightmares, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. He dreamt of the old wing, of the dark corridors and the figure that lurked there. He dreamt of patients' ghostly, emaciated figures wandering the halls, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and empty. In his dreams, the hospital was alive, a malevolent entity that fed on fear and despair. And at the heart of it all was the old wing, a festering wound that could never heal, a place where the boundary between life and death had been torn apart. One night, as Daniel was making his rounds, he heard a noise that made his blood run cold. It was a scream high-pitched, filled with terror, and it echoed through the empty halls. The sound came from the direction of the old wing. Daniel stopped, his heart racing. He didn't want to go back there, but the scream was unmistakable. Someone or something was in trouble. He hesitated for a moment, then made his way toward the old wing. The door was slightly ajar, just as it had been before, and the cold draft hit him as soon as he approached. The scream came again, louder this time, and Daniel's resolve hardened. He stepped into the corridor, flashlight in hand, and began to move forward. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The whispering started again, faint at first, then growing louder with each step he took. The scream came once more, closer now, and Daniel hurried toward the source. He reached a room at the end of the hallway, the door slightly open. The scream had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural moaning. Daniel pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from his flashlight, which illuminated a scene of horror. A figure lay on the bed, thrashing and writhing in pain. It was a patient, but there was something horribly wrong with them. Their skin was pale and stretched tight over their bones, their eyes sunken and hollow. They were emaciated, as if they had been starved for weeks, their body contorted in unnatural ways. As Daniel approached, the figure turned its head toward him, and he saw that their mouth was open in a silent scream, their eyes wide with terror. Daniel took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. This couldn't be real, this had to be another nightmare. But the figure on the bed was real, their suffering palpable, and Daniel knew he had to do something. He reached out, intending to help, but as soon as his hand touched the figure's skin, they let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the room, and Daniel was forced to cover his ears. The figure convulsed violently, their body arching off the bed, before collapsing in a heap. For a moment, the room was silent, save for Daniel's ragged breathing. He stared at the figure on the bed, but they were no longer moving. The silence was broken by the whispering, louder and more urgent than ever before. Daniel turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the walls. The temperature dropped even further, and the darkness in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from all sides. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was all Daniel could hear. The words were unintelligible, a chorus of voices overlapping, but the message was clear. He was not welcome here. He had to leave before it was too late. But the door was locked, and the room was growing colder by the second. The figure on the bed began to move again, their body twitching and jerking in unnatural ways. Daniel's flashlight flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. In the corner of the room, Daniel saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure from the hallway was standing there, its glowing eyes fixed on him. It didn't move, just watched, as if waiting for something. The whispering reached a fever pitch, and Daniel felt a crushing pressure in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the darkness closed in around him. The figure in the corner took a step forward, then another, until it was standing right in front of him. Daniel tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, and touched his chest. The pain was immediate and excruciating, like a knife being driven into his heart. The last thing Daniel saw before everything went black was the figure's face, twisted in a grotesque grin. Chapter 5. The End. Daniel never left the hospital that night. When Karen arrived for her shift the next morning, she found the security office empty. Daniel's belongings were still there, his jacket draped over the chair, his coffee cup half full on the desk, but there was no sign of him. The hospital launched a search, but it was as if Daniel had vanished into thin air. No one had seen him leave, and the security footage showed nothing out of the ordinary, except for the old wing. The camera feed from that area had gone dark around midnight, and when the maintenance team checked, they found the camera smashed to pieces. The old wing was searched, but no trace of Daniel was found. The only thing they discovered was an empty room, the bed neatly made, and a sense of unease that hung heavy in the air. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen in the hospital. Lights flickered, equipment malfunctioned, and staff reported seeing shadowy figures moving in the corners of their vision. The old wing, which had been sealed off for years, seemed to come alive, as if the building itself was waking from a long slumber. And then the deaths began. Patients who had been recovering suddenly took a turn for the worse, their conditions deteriorating rapidly. They spoke of nightmares, of being watched, of something dark and malevolent lurking in the shadows. Some of them even mentioned Daniel, as if they had seen him wandering the halls at night. The staff tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as the natural course of illness, but the deaths continued. The fear among the staff grew, and some of them quit, unable to handle the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over the hospital. The board of directors ordered the old wing to be sealed off completely, but it was too late. Whatever had been unleashed could not be contained. The darkness had spread, infecting the very heart of the hospital, and there was no escaping it. The last person to see Daniel was the old man who had warned him. He claimed to have seen Daniel wandering the streets late at night, his eyes empty, his face pale and gaunt. But when he tried to approach, Daniel disappeared into the shadows, as if swallowed by the night itself. The hospital remained open, but its reputation was forever tarnished. Patients and staff alike whispered of the hauntings, of the dark presence that lingered in the halls. The old wing was left to rot, a festering wound that would never heal. And somewhere, deep within the hospital, Daniel's spirit remained trapped, forever haunted by the horrors he had uncovered. The old wing had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him, and it would continue to claim more, feeding off the fear and despair of those who dared to enter its dark embrace. In the end, there was no escape. The darkness had won, and Daniel's story became just another chapter in the long, twisted history of Crestview Medical Center. As for the hospital, it stands to this day, its dark past hidden beneath layers of paint and modern renovations. But those who know the truth, those who have felt the cold breath of the old wing on the back of their necks, will never forget the horror that lurks within its walls. And they know, deep down, that the old wing is waiting, patient and hungry, for the next soul to wander into its grasp. Years passed, and the story of Daniel's disappearance became a local legend, whispered among the night staff and passed down to new employees as a cautionary tale. The hospital continued to operate, though it could never fully shake the sense of dread that hung over it. Every now and then, a patient would report seeing a shadowy figure in their room at night, or a nurse would feel a cold hand brush against them in the old wing. The hospital administration did their best to ignore these stories, attributing them to stress or overactive imaginations, but the staff knew better. The old wing was eventually bricked up, the entrance sealed off completely, but the darkness that had taken root there couldn't be so easily contained. It seeped through the walls, infecting the rest of the hospital. a malignant force that could never be truly exorcised. And though Daniel's story faded into obscurity, replaced by new horrors and new tragedies, the old wing remained a place of fear, a place where the living dared not venture, and the dead never left. For those who knew the truth, the lesson was clear. Some doors should never be opened, and some places are better left forgotten. But in a world where curiosity often overpowers caution, the old wing would continue to claim new victims, drawing them into its dark, twisted embrace, because the darkness never dies. It only waits, and the old wing of Crestview Medical Center is waiting still,